Julie, I asked you if it was on. I asked her if it was on. Is you? Okay. I can't tell you how delighted I am to. No, I'm just not going to do that. We'll not do that again. I want you to imagine that you are Job. I know it's difficult, but it's important that you imagine that you are Job. Now, you're a wealthy person. You have all kinds of livestock. You've even got she-donkeys to produce that valuable donkey milk. You have oxen. You have camels that are used in the transportation business. They were the 16-wheelers of the days of Job. And you've got plenty to rent out. You're wealthy with livestock. You've got everything. And you have 7 sons and 3 daughters, 10 children. Can you imagine having 10 children? I can't imagine having 10 children. We have 4 sons. You know why we have 4 sons? We didn't want 5. And when they start coming 2 at a time, I said, MJ, it's time to stop. We're not having any more. But Job had that perfect family. 7 sons and 3 daughters, 10 children. And they're all good people. And he is, if you want to look at chapter 29, whenever he went down to the gates of the city, the young men, when they saw him, they withdrew, and the older men rose and stood in the presence of Job. And the princes, the leaders of the people, whenever Job showed up down there, they stopped talking. And they just listened to Job. Men listened to me, he said, and waited and kept silence for my counsel. They just got quiet when Job showed up to hear what he had to say. And whenever Job spoke, that was the last word. Nobody else had anything to add to that. Job lived like a king among his troops. Now imagine that you're Job. Now that part might be easy. You know, it might be easy to imagine that you're rich. You're rich in every way it's possible to be rich. And that you've got this great family. And you've got this great influence. And people look up to you everywhere. In fact, if you're imagining that you are Job, you are the greatest person in the East. The greatest person in the East. Then there was a day. Then there was a day. And on that one day, one of his servants came, and he said, the oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were feeding beside them. And the Sabaeans fell on them, and took them all, and killed every servant save one. I'm that one. And while he was still giving the report and telling that news, another servant came, and he said, fire came from heaven and killed all of the sheep and all of the servants save one, and I am that one. And while he was talking, he said, the Chaldeans came in 3 groups and struck the camels and made a raid on the camels and took all of them and killed all the servants save one, and I'm that one. And while he was still speaking, the worst news of all came. All your sons and daughters and their family, they were over at your oldest son's house having dinner, and a great wind struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on them, and it killed every one of them, and it killed all the servants, and I'm the only one left. What a day. Then there was another day. There was another day. And Job woke up that morning, and he had sores all over his body from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet. Runny, festering sores. And he was in so much pain and so much torment. He just moved out of the house and he went out to the city dump to sit on a pile of ashes and scrape his runny sores. His poor wife, she'd lost everything too. She was once a wealthy woman, married to a wealthy man. But they have no wealth. They're the poorest of the poor. They've lost everything. She lost her family too. She lost her sons and her daughters. She lost all of her children too. She lost the whole family. How terrible that must have been. She has no servants anymore. And her husband has moved out of the house. He's out at the city dump, sitting on a pile of ashes, scraping his body with a broken piece of pottery. There's no honor in that. There's no dignity in that. So she goes out to the ash heap where her husband is. And she says, still hold fast to your integrity? You see, God himself had said about Job, he still holds fast his integrity. His wife comes out there where he is and says, why? Why? Are you still holding fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. Now, let me tell you something about husbands. I've been one 52 years. I know a little bit about husbands. Let me tell you something about Job, and it's something about husbands in general as well. Wives, when you talk to your husbands, guard your words. Speak very carefully. This may be a secret to some of you, especially the youth group over here. Women are made stronger by hard times, but men are made weaker. Men are made weaker. Job did not need his wife to come out there and suggest that he would give up his integrity. Never suggest, wives, that your husband give up their integrity, not even for a temporary relief, not even for a short time. No, what husbands need are encouragement and strength. What he needed to hear from his wife was, stand fast. Don't you ever give up. And wherever we need to go, I'll go with you. Whatever you need to do, I'll do it with you. I will go with you. Well, now he's lost his wife. He's lost his sons, his daughters, his wealth, his livestock, his businesses. He's lost his not his integrity. He holds that fast, but he's lost his influence. He's lost everything. Now he's lost his wife. Oh, but he has some friends. They're called three friends in chapter 2. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. We're introduced to them. Boy, with friends like that. But he's got three friends. And what we have now in the book of Job are these friends speaking to Job in three cycles of speeches. Eliphaz speaks, Job answers. Bildad speaks, Job responds. Zophar speaks, Job responds. Second round. Eliphaz speaks, Job. Bildad speaks, then Job. Then Zophar speaks, and then Job answers. Third round. Eliphaz speaks, Job responds. Bildad speaks, Job responds, and there's no use Zophar speaking anymore, and he doesn't. And then we have this long treatise from Job, and then the words of Job ended, and then out of nowhere comes Elihu. And he has a long, long speech. And the thinking of the friends is, generally speaking, rather than read all of those speeches and go through all of that, the general thinking of everyone, including Job for a while at least, is this: Job, you've done some terrible thing, and that's why you're being punished. You're suffering because of your sin. Eliphaz, chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Remember, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen those who plow iniquity, and so they reap the same. Sow trouble, they reap the same. You get what you deserve. Job, you're getting what you deserve. It's because of your sin that you're being punished. You're just reaping what you have sown. Bildad, chapter 18 and verse 7. Bildad says pretty much the same. It says about the wicked, his own schemes throw him down. And so that was the accusation leveled against Job. And this is what they'd always been taught. That's what they'd always thought. They'd always taught that and themselves. And Job included had been taught that as well. But Job's first reaction was, teach me. Teach me. I'll listen. Right here in chapter 6 and verse 24. Teach me and I'll be silent. Make me understand. Make me understand how I've gone astray. But no one does. His three so-called friends, they don't teach him where he has gone astray. They don't show him where he has gone astray. No one says, this is what you've done, Job, because he didn't. And the one he wants to hear from most of all, more than any, is God, and God is silent. There's nothing from God. No word from God. So in pain and in doubt, a sense of alienation grows. Job says, imagine my pain. Chapter 6, oh, that my vexation were weighed, all of my calamity laid in the balances. He's thinking of a scale that has balances, you know, with the basket on one side and the fulcrum and then the basket on the other. And he says, if you put my troubles on one side of that, it'll be heavier than the sand of the sea. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. He says down at the end of that chapter, just look at me. You can see what bad shape I'm in, how bad this is. Just look at me. And then verse 9 of chapter 6, verses 8 and 9. Oh, that I might have my request. I wish I could get what I want, that I might have my request, that it would please God to crush me. Just end it all right now. Bring it to an end. I want you to notice the back and forth of Job's confusion here. Chapter 7 and verse 16, he says to God, just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. But then in chapter 10, he says, well, I will say to God, here's what I want to say to God. If God would just give me audience, if I could talk to God, He would appear here and let me talk to Him. Here's what I want to say to God. Do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me. Tell me what your problem is with me. If I could, I wish that I could just speak to God and say that to Him. But then, in the same speech, he says in verse 20, leave me alone and let me have a little peace. My days are about to cease. I'm coming to my end. Just give me a little peace and leave me alone. But then, in chapter 13, in verse 3, he said, I want to speak to God. I want to talk to God. And if you're trying to follow along in this, in the book of Job, going down in chapter 13 and verse 3 when he says, but I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue my case with God. Now I'm hearing you, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, I'm hearing your arguments. They don't make sense. They're not right. I don't want to argue with you. I don't even want to talk to you. I want to argue my case with God. In verse 18, behold, I have prepared my case. I know that I shall be in the right. I have prepared my case. I'm ready to go with God to a court of law, and I've prepared my case, and I know I'm in the right. Verse 22, and he says to God, well, if you won't just discuss it, then you call, and I will answer. Or if you don't want it that way, God, you let me speak, and then you reply to me. And then he asks, how many are my iniquities and my sins? Make me know my transgressions and my sin. Why do you hide your face and count me as an enemy? Why are you treating me this way, God? And still in all of this, God is silent. And then he reaches the height of the alienation. And the height of Job's alienation is pictured in chapter 9 of the book of Job. He says, God is just not fair. Truly I know it is so, but how can a man ever be right with God? God is just not fair. Down in verse 16, if I summoned him and he answered me, I don't believe he'd listen to me. I don't even think he would listen to me. He describes God in chapter 16. At the height of his alienation, Job describes God as a wild beast who is ripping him to shreds in verse 9 of chapter 16. He describes God as a traitor who has turned him, his friend, his ally. God has turned Job over to the ungodly. He describes God as a wrestler in verse 12 who's got him in a headlock. He's got his arm around him. He's got him in a headlock. He describes God as an archer who has set him up as a target for God himself and for other archers. Shoot at Job. Just take a shot at Job. That's the way he describes God. He describes God as a warrior in verse 14 of the same chapter who runs against him. A warrior trained for battle. Job needs a mediator. Look at chapter 9 and verse 32, where Job says about God, well, he's not a man like I am, that I could answer him. And that we should go to trial together. How could we go to trial together? God is not a man like I am. He's not finite. He doesn't have the problems that I have. How could we possibly go to trial together, he and I, and have a discussion like this? So in verse 33, there's no arbiter between us who might lay his hand on us both. There's no arbiter who knows me as I am and knows God as he is, who can lay his hand on both of us and decide for us and help us to decide. I need an arbiter. I need a mediator. Friends, we know a man Job never knew. There's one God, and there's one mediator between God and man, himself man, Christ Jesus. He's our mediator. My little children, these things are, that's what Paul said to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5. My little children, these things I write unto you that you may not sin. But if you sin, actually since you sin, we have an advocate, a parakletos, an advocate with the Father. That's more than a mediator. That's one who pleads my case. That's a lawyer who's on my side. But that mediator, who is a man and himself God, can put his hand on both us and God, and he can relate to God because he is God, and he can relate to man because he's been a man and he's lived here. We have a Redeemer who is a mediator. We know someone Job did not know. But when you need help finding answers, when you need help settling your case, philosophical arguments just don't help much. When misery breaks the spirit and a mediator is not found, futile searches give no hope. Our mediator is not a philosopher. Our mediator is a redeemer. Then it happened. Then it happened. Job said in chapter 30, in verses 20 through 22, Job said, I cry to you for help, he said to God. I cry to you for help, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you only look at me. You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecute me. You lift me up on the wind. You make me ride on it, and you toss me about in the roar of the storm. Chapter 38, verses 1 and 2. Then the Lord spoke to Job from a whirlwind. Can you imagine the sound? Now, I have never heard it. I've never been that well. We've been pretty close to a tornado down in Haleyville one time. Judy, that tornado just went over the house there at Riddle Creek one Wednesday night right before Bible classes. And somebody called from, Jim Lampley called from the church and said, Andy, you all right? And I said, why wouldn't I be? I'm getting ready to go to church. He said, man, a tornado just went over your house. And I said, you're kidding. But I don't know how we missed that. But we were down in a hole and it just kind of jumped over us. But I didn't hear the roar. But I've heard people say who are that close to a tornado, it sounded like a freight train. You heard that? Can you imagine? I never heard that either, but I mean, you've heard them say that. You've heard people say that. It sounded like a freight train, right? Yeah. Well, can you imagine then God speaking to Job from a whirlwind, and then that sounds like a freight train. You know, God is talking to Job from a whirlwind that sounds like a train roaring by. And then when God speaks, what does God's voice sound like? Now, I've always wanted to know that, but I don't know if I want him to speak to me or not, because it might scare me to death. But I think, who led that prayer? What's your name? Bob. See, God would have a voice more like Bob's than mine. And Drew's. All right, just be honest, Drew. I mean, it's got to be more like Bob's than mine. I mean, he gets on that microphone, you know, he's got a radio voice. And I can imagine, and we have kind of a hint here in this book about God's voice when he spoke to Job. In chapter 40, he asked Job the question, can you thunder with a voice like God? thunder with a voice like God. So when God spoke, the ground shook. It was like thunder when God spoke. And so God spoke to Job from a whirlwind, and he says, with that thunderous voice, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? I mean, it's the first thing he says to Job. Job's been through this cycle of speeches, and this day and night he's been tormented with his pain, and his skin is like sloughing off and turning black, and his bones hurt, and he can't sleep, and he is such terrible, and that's on top of all the grief that he's suffered, and he's lost his family, and he's lost his wife, he's lost everything, and his friends are just persecuting him. He calls them miserable comforters. Well, it's an oxymoron, but it's a pretty good description, because they got together, they're from the east, and they made an appointment with each other, and they said, hey, let's go see Job. I heard he's had a bad time. You know, he's lost everything. We got to go. Let's go see Job. And they said, okay, let's go. When can we go? And so they go over there, and they go see Job, and they went to comfort and sympathize with him. It's what God wrote there in chapter 2. They went to sympathize with him and comfort him, and when they saw him, they didn't recognize him. He's so sick. They didn't even recognize the man, their friend, and they didn't even recognize him. He was so sick. And so they just sat down on the ground and just sat there and looked at him for 7 days and 7 nights. Can you imagine that? I mean, I visit a lot of people in the hospital, and I feel like I need to talk to them when I go there. I just don't sit down there all day and just look at them. But they just went and just sat down and looked at him. And then finally Job broke the silence and started talking. And so he went through all this cycle of speeches, and he went through all this argumentation. He went through all this. If we could get to a court of law, I've got my case ready to plead my case with God. And I'm ready to talk to him about it. I just wish he'd tell me what I've done wrong and just give me the number of my sins and tell me what those sins are. And the first thing that Job hears from God is that thunderous voice, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? And that's thrown right at Job. The first thing that gets my attention about that is suddenly there in Job chapter 38 and verse 1, it says, the Lord spoke to Job from a whirlwind. The Lord, not God, the Lord. And the word translated Lord there from the Hebrew is Yahweh. Yahweh. The great I am. Whenever Moses said, who shall I say has sent me? When I go back to Egypt, according to the command of God to deliver the people. Who shall I say sent me? Tell them the Lord sent you. I am. I am. The great I am. You see, God's always in the present tense. He's the great I am. There's no past with God. There's no future with God. He's always in the present tense. He's always I am. That was the most sacred name for God used by the Jews. Yahweh. And that's when Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am, that the Jews took up stones to kill him. In John chapter 8. Because he used the most sacred name of God for himself. That's the word that is used to describe who is speaking to Job from this whirlwind. Yahweh, the Lord. And he says, who is this who darkens? Darkens is the word that means to put into hiding. It has a sense of gloom involved in that word, a sense of hiding. So he says, who is this who is hiding counsel? And the counsel is plan, purpose. Who is this who is hiding my plan, who is hiding my purposes in words without knowledge? Knowledge, understanding. Who is this who is speaking these words without any understanding, and in doing so he's hiding my counsel, he is hiding my purpose? You know, friends, when we don't understand something, it'd just be much better for us to be quiet. just not to say anything. When you don't understand, just keep your mouth shut. And you might learn something. And you might not be spoken to from a whirlwind by a thundering voice saying, "Who are you to speak without knowledge?" I want you to notice before we go any further what God does not do when He speaks to Job. When He speaks to Job from this whirlwind after being silent for so long during Job's trial and suffering. By the way, let me ask you something. By this time you know Job better. You know who Job is. He was a righteous man, the greatest of all the East. He maintained his integrity. He was a righteous man. If God had gone to him, what if God had gone to Job and said, "Job, I'll tell you what's going to happen here. You're going to go through a trial. You're going to be tested like you've never been tested before. You're going to lose everything. But Job, I need you to be my man. I need you to stand up for me here. I need you to represent me well. I need you to do this for me. Would you do this for me?" What do you think Job would have said? "Yes, God. Yes, God. You can count on me. I will do it." Well, what about when God doesn't say anything? When God doesn't give you a warning? When God doesn't answer your questions? When God doesn't give you any knowledge? When God doesn't tell you about that meeting that He had in the heavenly realm, in the spiritual realm, when Satan and the other created beings appeared before Him, the sons of God appeared. God doesn't tell Him about all that. See, that's one thing God doesn't do even now, after the trial is going on. God, first of all, does not answer Job's questions. In what follows here, in the give and take with God and Job and the test that God gives to Job, God does not answer one of Job's questions. God does not explain to Job about that meeting in the spiritual realm with Satan. God does not apologize for not answering Job's questions. God does not apologize for His silence and not appearing to Job. God does not even acknowledge that Job has had any trouble. God never once says, "Job, I know you've had a hard time, but you've held up pretty good." No. Nothing like that. Instead, what God does do in chapter 40 and verse 7, He says, "Job, dress for action." Your translation may say, "Gird up your loins." That's a military term. He's telling Job, you better get ready for a battle because here it comes. Here it comes. Dress for action like a man. I want you to be a man now because I'm coming at you. God asked Job 77 questions. He asked him questions about his marvelous creation. God asked Job questions about the sea. God asked Job questions about the sun. He asked Job questions about outer space. Now, how many of you, so far removed from Job, with all of the knowledge that we have gained since Job, how many of you know that much about outer space? What's under the sea? He asked Job questions about the animal kingdom. Now, that's a little closer for Job's observation. He still failed. He still failed. You see, it's foolish to question God. Look at chapter 38 and how he approaches Job. In chapter 38, he starts with this, "Have you?" Verse 12, "Have you commanded the morning since your days began?" Verse 18, verse 16, "Have you entered into the springs of the sea?" Verse 22, "Have you entered the storehouses of the snow?" And then he went into, "Can you?" Verse 31, "Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion?" You know what I think is very interesting here is that they're talking about, God and Job are talking about constellations that you and I can see in the sky tonight. And they called them by the same names that we called them. And that was a long time ago. I used to think, I still think Job's the oldest book in the Old Testament. But I used to think, because of Boss Behemoth and Lofty Leviathan, that it was written even before the flood. Well, and I learned better, and I find out that Job is or rather Elihu, the last one to speak to Job of his friends. Elihu is a Buzzite of the family of Ram. Ram was a nephew of Abraham. So that puts him after Abraham in time, see, in historical time. Puts him after Abraham. Well, that may create a little more of a problem for us when we get to Behemoth and Leviathan, but I don't think so. We're not going to worry about it because it's not that big of a problem. But this was in Abraham's time that they were looking at the constellations and calling them by the same name that we do today. Verse 32, he asked Job, can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season? Verse 34, can you lift up your voice to the clouds? Verse 35, can you send forth lightnings? Can you make it lightning? And then watch how he does Job with this. In verse 38, verse 5, yeah. Surely you know. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know, he says to Job. Is he picking at him a little bit? Surely you know. And then he says over in verse 21, again, you know, for you were born then. You know, you were born then. A message from that is this. Here is where your heart will find rest, Job. Your heart will find rest when you find your place in the great panorama of the purposes of God. On the ash heap may be a good place for you to be when you're in mourning, but that is not where you'll want to stay if you want to get better. You need to find your place in the great panorama of God's purposes. Okay, Job begins to understand. And he finds out that he has been an independent, self-assured apologist for himself. But he's not anymore. Chapter 40 and verse 4. Well, I am of small account. I put my hand on my mouth. Shut my mouth. I should not have spoken. I am of small account. I am of too little. Now here are some lessons that we learn already from Job. If God's ways are higher than our ways, then we should submit to His will and follow Him. That's humility. We bow before His will and His decisions. That's humility. Number two, if God is in full control, then if God is in full control, I will follow His direction with all of my steps. And I will let Him be in control. And I don't have to solve every problem. And I don't have to answer every question. And I don't have to do everything. That's relief. That's relief. And if God has all of the answers to my questions and my problems, then I am going to listen in silence when God speaks. That's submission. Well, Job was silenced, and now he's humiliated. He has challenged God. He said, I know I will prevail. If I can just get an audience, I know I will prevail. He had charged God with mismanaging the affairs of the earth. And God's response is something like, well, Job, you seem to think that you're qualified to be God. But do you have an arm like God? Chapter 40 and verse 9. And then he introduces two terribly powerful beasts, animals, one of the land and one of the sea. And neither of these two powerful animals are subject to man. They do not crawl to man. They do not bow before man. And the conclusion is, man is not qualified to criticize the creator of these great beasts. The boss Behemoth. Drew's done a great job on choosing these subjects. How's he do it? For 20 years, he's had all these themes. Now, see another book, see? And how does he come up with all these? And I think his titles, are great. And he gave me, what'd you give me? Mighty Behemoth and Fierce Leviathan. But I like alliteration. So I got Boss Behemoth and So y'all haven't seen any of my slides because I'm just doing this thing and it's just, okay. All right. Okay. So boss Behemoth and lofty Leviathan, because I like alliteration. But look at, first of all, at Behemoth. In chapter 40 and verse 19, he is called by God the first of the works of God, the mightiest of all the beasts on the land. In fact, Behemoth is a plural. It's a plural form of the word. And that is just to magnify the majesty and the greatness of this beast. I like what the English Standard Version has done with these beasts. They transliterated the words, didn't try to translate them because they had not a clue. Nobody ever had a clue. Nobody had a clue how to translate Behemoth or Leviathan. So the English Standard translators didn't even try. They put a footnote down there and say, exact animal unknown. They admitted. They had the humility. They had the courage to say, we don't know what this beast is. I appreciate that. You know, that's what I like. You know, that's what I wish our politicians would do. That's what I wish the people that dealt with this COVID thing had done all the time. They'd said, we don't know. We're learning just like you are. We don't know. But they didn't have the courage to do that or the humility to do that. But these translators did because they didn't know. And we know they didn't know what kind of a beast that was. But I'm going to tell you what Job knew. Job knew what kind of beast that was. Now, for some reason, translators have had to make this a hippopotamus. And you'll read some translations and they'll say hippopotamus. If not in the text, it'll be in the footnote. But I want to ask you something. In verse 17, he makes his tail stiff like a cedar. A hippopotamus's tail is about 8 or 10 inches long. I got cedar trees in my yard bigger than a hippo's tail. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. I don't think it's a hippopotamus. Why do we think we have to call it a hippopotamus? Why can't we say, you know, this animal, whatever it was, it became extinct? You know, a lot of animals have become extinct since the flood. Even in my lifetime, and I'm an old guy, I know, but I mean, you know, a lot of animals have become, they do it all the time. Animals become extinct. Why can't we just say, hey, this animal, Job knew this animal, he was afraid of this animal, but we have never seen such an animal, and I hope I never do. I hope I never come up on something like this. I don't know why we have to pick a hippo or make it mean some animal that's alive on the earth today. We don't have to. It could be an animal that is extinct. And but some people say it was a myth. It was a mythological creature. But chapter 15 has God saying to Job, behold Behemoth, which I made just like I made you. That means it wasn't a myth. God made it just like he made Job. That animal was just as real as Job was. Well, I don't know what it was, but Job was afraid of it. Leviathan, quickly. I'm glad Drew read that text, verses 1 through 9 of chapter 41 a while ago, because we don't have time to do it right now. And you know, some people say that's a crocodile. And they put that in the footnote and even in the text. Well, okay, it's a crocodile. Let's go over to chapter 41. Look down at verse 25. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. Have y'all ever seen a crocodile raise up on its hind legs to scare people? I just can't see that being a crocodile. And verse 34 says he sees everything that is high. A crocodile couldn't see over a 2-foot wall. Sees everything that is high. I don't think this is a crocodile. Besides, this animal, 18, he sneezes, his sneezing flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his nostril, out of his mouth, rather, go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils come forth smoke as from boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. Now, Don Shackelford wrote an excellent commentary on the book of Job for Truth for Today commentaries. And listen, anybody that's ever heard me preach more than once has heard me give praises to the Truth for Today commentaries and recommend them. And I recommend the one on Job, but Brother Shackelford says this is a crocodile. And when he comes out the river and blows that mist of water out of his nose in the morning sunlight, it looks like a bright stuff. Listen, you can't set coals on fire with mist blowing from your nostrils. There's just too much here about flames from this creature. And what is to keep us from understanding that there was a creature in the time of Job who was so awesome, who could breathe fire and smoke, but is now extinct? There were fiery serpents who bit the Israelites in the wilderness in the book of Numbers. I don't know. Now, they might have been red in color, and that's why they called them fiery. I don't know, but they were terribly poisonous and deadly. Listen, how many of you have heard of a dragon? Listen, dragon mythology, dragon lore has been around since before the New Testament was started in writing. Dragons are mentioned in the apocryphal literature. I don't believe there are fire-breathing dragons flying around in the skies in medieval times, but where'd the idea come from? Ideas, mythologies, things like that come from fact. They're based on fact. Not saying that a dragon lived in the time of Job and breathing fire and, burning villages with its snorts, but I'm saying that there was an animal in the time of Job that had this awesome power to do something like breathe fire and smoke that just sent the fear of God in everybody who ever saw it. Drew read the conclusion of all of this tonight at the end of that text, verse 9 of chapter 40. I made him. Now who can stand before me? I made him. You think you can stand before me, the one who made that awesome creature? Now our time is gone, so we have to bring this to a conclusion. We learn from these two awesome creatures as well as the rest of the book of Job that when God speaks, we need to listen and we need to wait on Him. We need to wait on Him. And we need to remember that I am not God. You and I and all of it, we cannot take His place. But here's the most important thing to remember. We have a mediator. We have a mediator who can put his hands on both of us. He can put his hand on God's shoulder, so to speak, and put his hand on my shoulder. And he can relate to me, and he can say to God, He's your child. He's your child. Here's his problem. Let me tell you his problem. And he wants to do what's right. And he wants to repent of his sin. And he'll turn away from that sin. And he's repented. He's confessed me as the Messiah, as the Lord God. I know his sin hurts you. I know that. Because I'm God and it hurts me. I know that. But he wants to be on your side. He wants to be with you forever. And God the Father, I, God the Son, I'll do everything I can. I'll give my life for him. Or her. That's a redeemer. That's a mediator who's a redeemer. I want him on my side. I'm like Job. I need a redeemer. I need a redeemer. How can I talk to God? I'm just a man who has made so many mistakes. How can I ever talk to God? I need a mediator to talk to God for me. One who can put his hands on both of us. That's what I need. And that's what I've got. I want that. Don't you? Don't you need that Redeemer to plead your case? You're going to have to give it up. You're going to have to do like Job and say, I am of small account. I put my hand on my mouth. You're nothing. Jesus is everything. But Jesus will make you something. Just like he did these kids on Sunday. He made them something. and He'll make you something if you'll come to the Lord and give yourself to Him tonight while we're standing and singing.